In the summer of 1950, the world held its breath. On a narrow peninsula in East Asia, a conflict erupted that would define the Cold War, draw in global superpowers, and leave scars that remain to this day. This is the story of the Korean War, often called the Forgotten War, but a conflict whose consequences are anything but forgotten. To understand how it started, we need to go back to the end of World War II. Korea, after decades of Japanese rule, was finally free. But its liberation was complicated. The victorious Allies decided to divide the peninsula along the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union would oversee the north, and the United States would manage the south. This was meant to be a temporary arrangement, a stepping stone to a unified, independent Korea. But, as we know, temporary lines on a map have a way of becoming permanent borders. In the north, a communist state was established under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, a former anti-Japanese guerrilla fighter backed by Moscow. In the south, a pro-Western, anti-communist government was formed, led by Syngman Rhee, who had spent years in exile in the U.S. Both leaders were fiercely nationalistic, and both claimed to be the rightful ruler of all of Korea. The division hardened. The 38th parallel, once an administrative line, became an ideological iron curtain. Tensions were simmering for years, with frequent border skirmishes, but on June 25, 1950, everything changed. In a surprise dawn attack, nearly 100,000 North Korean troops, equipped with Soviet tanks and artillery, stormed across the 38th parallel. The South Korean army, ill-prepared and outgunned, was quickly overwhelmed. The capital, Seoul, fell in just 3 days. The world was shocked. The United States, fearing the domino effect of communism spreading across Asia, saw this not as a simple civil war, but as a direct challenge from the Soviet bloc. President Truman acted swiftly. He bypassed a congressional declaration of war and went to the newly formed United Nations. The Soviet Union, boycotting the Security Council at the time over a dispute about China's seat, wasn't there to use its veto power. This allowed the UN to pass a resolution condemning the invasion and authorizing a multinational force to defend South Korea. And so, soldiers from the United States and 15 other nations joined the fight under the UN flag. The initial months were a desperate struggle. North Korean forces pushed the UN and South Korean troops all the way down to a tiny corner of the peninsula, a defensive line known as the Pusan Perimeter. It seemed like the entire country was on the verge of collapse. The situation was grim. But then, in a move of strategic genius and immense risk, General Douglas MacArthur, the celebrated World War II hero and commander of the UN forces, orchestrated a daring amphibious landing at Incheon, a port city far behind enemy lines near Seoul. The gamble paid off spectacularly. The North Korean supply lines were cut, and their forces, caught between MacArthur's troops in the west and the army breaking out from Pusan in the south, began to crumble. Seoul was liberated, and UN forces pushed north, crossing the 38th parallel with a new objective, not just to defend South Korea, but to unify the entire peninsula under a non-communist government. By late 1950, they had captured the North Korean capital of Pyongyang and were advancing rapidly towards the Yalu River, the border with China. Victory seemed within grasp. But MacArthur had made a critical miscalculation. China's new communist leader, Mao Zedong, had repeatedly warned that he would not tolerate American troops on his border. He saw the UN advance as a direct threat to China's own security. In October, Mao made good on his threat. In secret, hundreds of thousands of Chinese People's Volunteers poured across the Yalu River. They launched a massive surprise counteroffensive, unleashing human wave attacks against the stunned and overextended UN forces. The winter of 1950 was brutal. Ill-equipped for the sub-zero temperatures, American and UN troops began one of the longest and most difficult retreats in military history. The war had taken a dramatic and terrifying new turn. The conflict now devolved into a brutal war of attrition. The front lines surged back and forth across the 38th parallel. Seoul changed hands 4 times in total. The fighting was savage, with both sides suffering immense casualties. The high-flying jet-to-jet combat in the skies over an area known as Migali marked a new era of aerial warfare. On the ground, soldiers battled not only the enemy, but also the unforgiving mountainous terrain and extreme weather. The war became a bloody stalemate. Back in Washington, frustration mounted. General MacArthur, publicly disagreeing with President Truman's strategy of a limited war, called for expanding the conflict into China, even suggesting the use of nuclear weapons. For Truman, this was a step too far, risking a full-blown World War III with China and potentially the Soviet Union. In a hugely controversial decision, Truman fired his most famous general for insubordination. With the fighting locked in a stalemate around the 38th parallel, peace talks began in July 1951. But they would drag on for 2 long, agonizing years. The main sticking point was the repatriation of prisoners of war. Many North Korean and Chinese prisoners held by the UN did not want to return to their communist homelands, a point the communists refused to accept. While diplomats argued, the soldiers continued to fight and die for small, strategically insignificant hills with names like Porkchop Hill and Heartbreak Ridge. Finally, after the death of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and increased pressure from the new Eisenhower administration in the U.S., a breakthrough was reached. An armistice agreement was signed on July 27, 1953. It wasn't a peace treaty. It was simply a ceasefire. The agreement established a new boundary, the military demarcation line, which snaked across the middle of the peninsula, surrounded by a 4-kilometer-wide demilitarized zone, or DMZ. The war was over, but the conflict was not. The human cost was staggering. Estimates vary, but it's believed that up to 3 million people died, the vast majority of them Korean civilians. Over 36,000 American soldiers lost their lives, along with thousands more from other UN nations. The Korean peninsula was left in ruins, a landscape of rubble and despair. In the decades that followed, South Korea, with massive international aid and an incredible national drive, rebuilt itself into a vibrant democracy and a global economic powerhouse. North Korea, in contrast, became one of the most isolated and repressive dictatorships in the world, a totalitarian state perpetually on a war footing. Today, the DMZ remains the most heavily fortified border on Earth. The two Koreas are still technically at war. The armistice of 1953 holds, but it's a fragile truce. The Korean War may be the forgotten war for many in the West, but for the Korean people, it is a living history, a painful division that continues to shape their destiny. It stands as a stark reminder of the Cold War's devastating power and a conflict whose final chapter has yet to be written. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into history. See you next time.